Have you ever wondered why your inbox is empty while others land interviews and clients left and right? You've got skills, passion, and dedication, but something's just not clicking. What if the one thing holding you back is your portfolio? There could be countless doors closing one by one simply because your portfolio isn't making the right impression. But what if I told you that in just a couple of hours, you could create a portfolio that transforms your weakest link into your strongest asset? A portfolio that doesn't just showcase your work, but opens doors, sparks interest, and lands you the opportunities you've been missing. That's exactly what you'll be building in this video. This is more than just a portfolio. This is a visual masterpiece that draws you in from the first moment, with smooth animations that bring your project to life and transitions that guide the viewer effortlessly from one section to the next. This will be a true reflection of your talent. Every detail is meticulously crafted to create an experience that not only showcases your work, but makes it unforgettable. This is a portfolio that commands attention, sparks curiosity, and leaves a lasting impression. But this tutorial isn't just about creating a pretty site. Not only will you be crafting a pixel-perfect page, you'll also be gaining hands-on experience with the same frameworks that power enterprise-grade applications. You'll dive into React and Next.js, learning how to build a fast, responsive, and highly interactive portfolio page that performs as beautifully as it looks. Tailwind CSS will enable you to style your site with precision and speed while keeping your code clean and manageable. And with Framer Motion, you'll master the art of animation, adding smooth transitions and dynamic effects that make your portfolio stand out. Plus, we'll go beyond the basics with custom CSS animations, giving you the tools to create a user experience that's not only stunning, but lightning fast. And the best part? I'm providing all the design files and starter code for free. You'll have everything you need to follow along and create your own unique portfolio. Don't let another day go by with a portfolio that's holding you back. Invest in yourself now and watch as the doors start to open. Now, before we start, I want to remind you that all of the design files, starter code, and resources I mentioned are all available for free. You can find the link to download these assets in the description below. Make sure to grab them so you can follow along step by step. Make sure you subscribe to this channel so you know when part 2 of this video is released. Enough talk, let's build. Once you have your starter files downloaded, simply drag and drop them into your IDE, and that will allow you to get started in the code. After we have our project open, let's go ahead and install our dependencies. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my terminal, and then I'm going to run npm install, and that will, after a couple of seconds, make sure that all of our dependencies are properly installed in this project. After that, let's go ahead and take a look at what's actually inside of our template. So you can see that this is set up as a Next.js template. So we have a next config. If I go in that file, let me go ahead and close out my terminal for a second. I can see that I have not just a standard config, I'm actually adding in a separate Webpack config. And the specific reason I'm doing this is because we're going to be loading SVGs in this project. So I want to make sure that I have that Webpack configured correctly, but that should already be set up for you. We're going to be using SVGR, as you can see, that SVGR/Webpack loader in order to do that SVG transformation. Also in the root of my project, I have a post CSS config, and you can see that we're both loading Tailwind CSS and we're loading Auto Prefixer. And Auto Prefixer will essentially ensure that any browser that we use, if it has a specific prefix that needs to be added to any CSS rules, that those are properly added. So that Auto Prefixer is very important there, but of course we're using Tailwind CSS for our styles, so that plugin is installed there. Moving into the Tailwind config, let's take a look at that real quick. We have a pretty normal configuration here. I have added in a components folder in case we need to add any components that we can reuse. And we also have changed our breakpoints a little bit and our container default settings. So we have our 3 breakpoints, our 375, our 768, and our 1200. That's going to be our small, medium, and large screens. And then for our container, we're going ahead and setting the default padding on the left and right to 1 rem or 16 pixels. And then once we get to the medium size or the 768 size, we're going to increase that to 2 rems or 32 pixels left and right. And we want to make sure that that's always centered on the screen as well. So that takes care of that configuration. Other than that, we are going to be doing some different things in this Tailwind config, but I haven't added anything yet because I want to walk you through the process of how we'd set that up in our project. Moving into the source directory, let's take a look here. We have 4 different folders in here, and this is once again a pretty standard app router setup for Next.js. So inside of our app, we have our globals CSS, which right now is just loading our Tailwind. We also have our layout, which is the wrapper around all of our pages. And then we have our page.tsx, which right now has an H1 with homepage. We also have an assets directory that's going to hold all of our icons and images that we're going to use throughout the project. So all of those are available to us there. Inside components, there's nothing in there right now, but if we have a reusable component, we'll add it there. And then inside of our sections, we already have preloaded all of the sections that we are going to create. However, there's not any code in any of these right now because we are going to be the ones that are going to be creating that code as we walk through this project. In order to go ahead and see what this is looking like as it is right now, let's go ahead and open up our terminal one more time. And let's go ahead and run npm run dev, and that will allow us to pull up the browser window and start this project for the first time. Once we have our browser window open, let's go ahead. I'm going to pull this out. This is actually the Polypane browser that we're going to be using for this project. I'm going to show you how we want to configure this so that we can easily get our design and code something according to that design. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that we have our project loaded here. And then I want to make sure that each of our panes are going to show a different responsive view in the right size. I can come up here and I can of course select a viewport size. For example, our smallest one is going to be an iPhone 12, 13 mini or a mobile size. So I can select that because that already has that 375 width. And then I could just call this mobile and I'll say 375 pixels, and that will set up my mobile view for me. After that, I can add a new pane, and this is going to be my tablet. So let's see if we can find one that's around that 768 size. And it looks like this iPad Pro one is the right size for that. And I'm going to call this tablet 768 pixels. And then for my desktop size, I can also set that up by adding a new pane. And let's see if it has any that are the right size. It does not for our laptop size. So I'm just going to select the first laptop size here. And I'm going to go ahead and adjust the size over here to our 1200 pixels, the way that we're going to have it set up. And I'm just going to call this desktop. And I'm going to go ahead and say that it's going to be 1200 pixels wide. So that will allow us to have all 3 of our responsive views already set up and ready to go when we're ready to look at them. The other thing we want to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a reference image to each of these views so that we can see our design as we're coding it up. So I'm going to go ahead here and I'm going to click to select an image, and I'm going to select this from my designs. I'm going to go ahead and open up the mobile design from here, and I'm going to say open, and that's actually going to overlay the mobile design onto a screen that is the same size. And I have some different options of how I can see this. So I can see this side by side if I'd like to see this while I'm coding it up. I can see this overlaid on top, and I can even go and see what the differences are if I want to see that as my reference image is available. So that's something I'm definitely going to use for this because it's just going to make it so much easier for us to see if we're creating pixel perfect code, because of course we're going to have the design right there that we can overlay right on top. And then there's this other cool feature that allows us to actually drag it and go ahead and see our design versus the design itself. So that's going to allow us to be able to drag that back and forth and see if we've created it perfectly, pixel perfect to the design. So I'm going to do the same thing for my tablet and desktop view. So I'm going to come up to reference image. I'm going to select that image. So I'm going to select the tablet image for that one. And then on my desktop, I'm going to go ahead and select the desktop reference image. So I'm going to click there and select the desktop image. Now you don't need this in order to create this page, but of course this is going to be super helpful for us, especially if you're learning this and you want to try this on your own, or you want to see if you can make something that's very close to the reference image. It just makes it so much easier for you to create this in a pixel perfect way. Now that we have all that set up, I'm going to focus on my mobile view. I'm going to come up to here and I'm going to say focus, and we're just going to be looking at the mobile view. So I'm going to slide this window over, and that'll allow us to go ahead and get started. Now, as we look at our mobile design, the first thing we're going to work on is our header. So let's go ahead and take a look. We can see that it has 4 navigation items: home, projects, about, and contact, and that the contact button is highlighted from the get-go. You can also see it has a little bit of blur to what's going on in the background, has a little bit of light white opacity back there, and then it also has that border with a little bit of padding, and it's in the center screen. As we move over into the tablet design, it looks pretty much the same. So it's just centered on the screen, but it looks exactly the same as it did on mobile. And of course on desktop, it also looks the same there. So we just basically need to build a header that stays in the center of the screen and make sure that it has the right colors and backgrounds and borders and all of that. That will get us to where we need to go here. Now that we've seen what we're after with our design, let's go ahead and start creating the header section. So coming into my app/page.tsx, I need to import my header section into here. So I'm going to come up to the top and say import header from @/section/header. I'm going to drop it in as a replacement for my h1. So now it's going to be header right here, just as a component with no props. And as soon as I save that, I should see my header section showing up over here under my half opacity design. And I do see that. I see the words header section, which means that my header section is properly linked to my page. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out. I'm going to open up my header.tsx section, and I'm going to go ahead and start putting in the content for this section. Of course, it doesn't say header section, so we need to put a semantic nav tag here. And inside our nav tag, we need 4 links. So I'm going to create those with a href equals hash for now, just to give them a dummy link. I'm going to copy and paste that 4 times. And then inside my first one, I know I need home. My second one, I need projects. My third one, I need it to say about. And my fourth, I need to say contact. After I save that, I should see those words showing up here on the right. And what I know about this is, of course, my entire design is based in a dark mode design, but everything I have right now is black text on a white background. So before I actually style this section, what I want to do is set some base styles for my page. So I'm going to come back into app, and I'm going to go to the layout, which has the body tag, and this will allow me to add some base styles to the page itself. So one of the things I'm going to add, I'm going to go ahead and say class name here. And then I'm going to give it a base background color. That's going to be BG Gray 900 for that. And I also want by default all of my text to be white. So I'm going to say text white here, and that will make my text show up in white there. A couple of other things that I know I'm going to need, but isn't readily obvious, is my anti-alias rule. As you can see, what this does is it adds WebKit and Firefox font smoothing to make it match designs a lot more closely. It actually makes the text a little bit thinner is what it does. But if you put this into a design program, it's going to match your designs a lot more closely if you use this anti-alias rule at the top. The other thing I know I'm going to need to do inside my layout is go ahead and import my fonts. Now I could use a direct Google font import, but one of the nice things about Next.js is they have optimized fonts that we can import. I'm going to be using 2 fonts in this case, so I'm going to import those from next/font/Google. They're both Google fonts. The first font is going to be Inter, so I need to import that helper, and I also need to import my Calistoga. So I'm going to say Calistoga, and those both come from that next/font optimized bundle. I also need to tell those next fonts how I want them to load. So I'm going to create a inter variable, and that's going to be where I'm going to instantiate my inter font here. I'm going to tell it that we need the Latin subset. So I'm going to say subsets Latin. And I'm also going to tell it that we want to use a variable to tell it when to show up. So I'm going to say variable font sans. So when we use the font sans variable, I can connect this through this option to Tailwind CSS, which I'm going to do here in a second. And that's going to be our sans font. Now for our serif font, we're going to use Calistoga. So I need to do the same thing here. I'm going to say const Calistoga, and that's going to be equal to this Calistoga function with the Latin subset. So subsets Latin. And I also want to say variable -- font serif, and that's going to allow me to hook that up. Now, for some reason, this only has a 400 weight, so I also need to go ahead and define that here. So I'm going to say weight 400, and that will make sure that it is properly defined and that TypeScript is happy with what's going on. So I have my inter and my Calistoga class names that I can add. So I'm going to come into my class name here and add both of those fonts to the body. In order to do that, I'm going to use a Tailwind merge function. So I'm going to say TW merge, and I'm going to import that from Tailwind-merge, and that's going to allow me to add more classes to this dynamically using this Tailwind merge function. So I'm going to say inter.class name. So I want that class to be added. I want my Calistoga.class name to be added. But of course, we need to hook this up to Tailwind CSS using our variables. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that right now. Coming into our Tailwind config, let's go ahead and extend our default theme with our font family. So I'm going to say font family here. And for sans, we're going to say that anytime we use that variable that we define, font sans, we want the sans serif font. And for serif, we're going to say anytime we use the variable font serif, we want to use the serif font family. So this is basically the connection between those hosted Google fonts and Tailwind CSS, where it's basically looking for the variable that the Next.js font optimized library is dropping in, and it's using that. Anytime we say font sans, we're going to use the default inter font. And anytime we say font serif, we're going to be using the Calistoga font. That's how that's going to all work. And then up in our layout, we just need to add one more thing, and that's by default, we want the sans font. So I'm going to say font sans here, and that's going to go ahead and drop that in there correctly. And that will all happen once we save our Tailwind config as well. So let me go ahead and refresh my page. Now, the reason this isn't working out quite like we want it to, and I'm seeing this like times font over here, is because we don't actually want to say class name. We want to say variable. We want to give it the variable fonts up here in the class name, and that will hook up everything that we've done with our font variables or our font custom properties to Tailwind CSS. So I apologize for the confusion there, but that was the problem, is that we have to say the font name or the object that we've created dot variable, and that will allow us to hook those up correctly. So now we're seeing the inter font. If we were to switch this to font serif, we should see Calistoga, and that's exactly what happened. So that means everything is hooked up correctly. I'm going to switch that back to font sans. And then with all that hooked up correctly, we can go ahead and go back to our header.tsx. So I'm going to close out my layout, close out my page, and that will allow us to focus on the styles for our header. Inside of our header, we know that we were going to want to flex all these to the center. So I'm going to say class name equals flex and justify center. We're also going to want the items to be aligned center. So I'm going to say item center. And for now, we're going to make this relative. We're going to switch this to fixed in the future, but for now, we're going to make it relative just so we can offset it from the top. So I'm going to say top 3 to offset it by 12 pixels from the top, like our header over here. Inside there, we know we are going to need to add some padding to each of our links and make sure that they have the proper styles here as well. So I'm going to say class name on the first one, and I'm going to say px4 to give it 16 pixels of padding left and right. I'm going to say py 1.5 to give it 6 pixels of padding top and bottom. We want the outer border radius to be rounded full. I'm going to say rounded full there for 100% border radius there. And the text is going to be white with an opacity of 70. So I'm going to say text white /70, and that should make the text the proper color. The text should also be small. So I'm going to say text small here, and that will drop that down. We also want our font to be semi-bold. So I'm going to say font semi-bold, and that will make the font the right weight. And as we can see, we are between our design and our text right now, it looks like those are the same size and the same weight, which means I think we have the proper classes for these nav items. Now I could copy and paste all of these classes to all of these nav items, but I'm going to go to my globals. I'm going to set up a little helper to allow us to go ahead and have a class that we can use for all of these nav items. So I'm going to come into my globals. I'm going to say at layer base. And in that base, I'm going to say nav item. And for each of those nav items, we're going to apply the styles for our first one that we did. So I'm going to just copy and paste all of these. So I'm going to cut that out of there, paste that into our apply rule. And now whenever we use the nav item class, it's going to go ahead and apply all of the classes that we have, these Tailwind CSS classes. I'm going to say nav item here, and that should allow that to be applied. And as we can see, if we save, the same thing is true. So that means that instead of writing all those or copying and pasting all those, I can just come to each of my nav items and say class name equals nav item, and that will allow all of those styles to be correctly applied. Now that we have that done, let's focus on our nav itself. So I'm going to say class name here, and we know that this is going to be flexed as well. This is also going to allow us to control the spacing between them. So I'm going to say gap1 to add 1 unit or 4 pixels of spacing between them. We also want to have a little bit of padding here. So I'm going to say P0.5, and that's going to add the little bit of padding there. And as you can see right now, we're actually very close to having things set up the way that we need it to. We just need our border on here as well. So we need a border. That border is going to be white with 15% opacity. So border white /15. And we know we want that to be rounded with the same 100% border radius. So I'm going to say rounded full, and that's going to add the border radius that we need there. Now that we've gotten pretty close to what we want to see, I'm going to switch this back over to our horizontal layout because I want to switch the design out left and right so that we can really see what we're missing from our reference image versus what we're seeing. So I'm going to say side by side here, and that will allow us to see what we're missing in our design versus what we have right now in our code. So one of the things that we're missing is a background for this nav. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in. That's going to be BG white /10 for 10% opacity. We also want a blur. So I'm going to add that backdrop blur, but we're not going to see that right away, and that's fine. So I'm going to say backdrop blur, and that'll add the little bit of blur whenever we eventually scroll this down the page. And of course, our fourth nav item is going to be a little bit different than the other three. So I see that it has a white background instead of the normal transparent background. So I'm going to come down to my fourth nav item. I'm going to add some overrides here. So I'm going to say nav item, and then I'm going to say BG white for that fourth one. The text is going to be our text gray 900 so that the text shows up as the right color. And then from here, we can just add some nice hover effects that aren't obvious in the design, but are something we'll definitely want to add in here. So we can come back to our nav item class and go ahead and directly add those there. That way they're going to automatically apply to all of our nav items. And of course, we're going to override that right here. So I'm going to come back to my globals.css. I'm going to add some hover effects here. So I'm going to say hover. We're going to say BG white 10 to give it 10% opacity when we hover over those. We also want the text to be white when we hover. So I'm going to say hover text white. And then let's go ahead and hover those and see what actually happens when we do that. So, okay, we're getting some nice hover effects, but it's happening right away. We want a little bit of transition there. So I'm going to say transition to add a little bit of a transition effect, and duration 300 to set that transition duration to 300 milliseconds. So as soon as I save that, we should see a nice smooth effect on those hovers. What we know is that our last one is going to be a little strange because I don't think we want that much of a change to happen in our last nav item. So let's go ahead and add the overrides there. Coming back into our header.tsx, we're going to say that when we hover this one, our background is going to be white with 70% opacity. And of course, we're also going to need to set our text color here as well. So hover is going to stay the same, text gray 900. That should make sure that it doesn't change to white. So let's go ahead and hover that. And yeah, that just gives that a little bit of effect where you know that it's being hovered, but it's not changing all the way to white text or a white background. Now it's just going ahead and giving that little bit of a hover effect. Now that we've done that, I think our header looks good to the design. So I'm going to go ahead and overlay it again so that we can make sure that there's no differences, and I'm not seeing any differences. Let's go ahead and go back and forth. We do see a little bit of a difference just because we have a different background in our hero, but other than that, we have a pixel perfect design to the image, and that is working really, really well. Really happy with how our header turned out, which means it's time for us to move on to the next section. Really happy with how our header turned out in the mobile version, but of course we need to go ahead and make sure that it still looks good on the tablet and desktop. So coming over to those designs, let me go ahead and scoot my browser out a bit so we can get a better view of how this is looking on tablet. Now it should be exactly the same. We already know this. So let me go ahead and pull this over and make sure there aren't any differences to my tablet design, and that is looking perfect as well. Scooting over to my desktop design, let's go ahead and pull this over again and see if there are any differences, and I don't see any differences. It is pixel perfect to the design, which is exactly what we wanted. Now that our mobile, tablet, and desktop view are taken care of for the header, let's go ahead and move on to the hero section. Now that we have the header complete, let's talk about the design for the hero section. So what we can see is that we have a Memoji image above an availability little tagline here, and we have a title, description, and a couple of buttons that are stacked on top of each other in the mobile view. Over in the tablet view, we have essentially the same thing. It looks like our text size gets a little bit bigger in this particular section, and we start to really see the effect of the stars that we're eventually going to be animating and rotating around this section. And of course, over in the desktop view, we get an even better look at what those are going to look like. A couple of other things that I'm noticing is that you're going to see a slight fade of the rings that are in the hero section up here on the top and down on the bottom as we move to next section. So we're gonna have to make sure that that is being masked appropriately. And there's also a grain texture that you're going to see popping out in this background. It might be difficult to see, but as we zoom in, you can see it is definitely not just a static color. There is a grain texture that we're going to bring in here as well. And that's just going to make that stand out a little bit more from a regular static gradient color here in design. So that's about it for our hero design. Let's go ahead and jump into the code and see if we can create this. Now that we know what we're after for our hero section, let's go ahead and dive into the code and code section up. The first thing we'll need to go do is go into source/app/page and bring that hero section into our page.tsx by importing hero section from @section/hero and then just dropping that into our page by just putting the component there. When we save, we should see that the hero section shows up, and indeed that does. But one thing I'm noticing is that the hero section should be below our header, and the reason that's not happening is because the header is currently position relative. It needs to be position fixed like it's going to be once this entire project is done. So I'm actually going to go into my header section and change relative to fixed. That should make sure that the hero section actually comes under our header, and that's exactly what we want to happen. So after I close out header and go into my hero.tsx, then we can just concentrate this code. So I'm going to close out my page, I'm going to close out my sidebar, and we're just going to have the code sitting here. To make this a little bit easier to see, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring out my browser and I'm going to push my reference image to a side-by-side view so we can see what we have on the left and what the reference image is actually showing on the right. That will allow us to work a little more easily without having the overlay there. Now in my section code, I'm going to go ahead and create a container first. So div class name equals container. And that is just basically making sure that our content doesn't touch the left and the right sides of the page. And then inside that, the first part of my content is my image. So I need to import that image. I'm going to import my Memoji image from @/assets/images/memoji-computer.png. And then in order to pull that in, I'm going to also use next/image. So if I start to use image from next/image here, I should be able to click that and import that automatically through most IDEs, including VS Code. And then I can just say that my source is my Memoji image, and I need to add an alt tag, otherwise TypeScript will be upset. So I'm going to say person peeking from behind laptop and add that there. Under that, we have this little available for new projects banner. So I'm going to wrap that in a div. I know I'm going to need a dot, so I'm going to go ahead and place a div for that. And then for my text content, I'm going to place a div where I'm going to say available for new projects and save that. And we should see that on the screen, which we do. Under that, we have a semantic H1 tag where we're going to say building exceptional user experiences. And then under that, we have a paragraph where we're going to have some text description. I'm going to copy and paste that from the design that I have. And then I'm going to put the buttons below that. We know that the buttons are going to be top to bottom flexed. So I'm just going to wrap those in a div, and then I'm going to have two button tags. Each button does have some sort of icon or image beside it. So my text is going to need to go in a span tag, and then that is going to allow me to position the icons or whatever is beside it, the button text. So I'm going to say explore my work here. We know that we're going to need to bring in that icon, so I can do that now. I'm going to import my arrow down from @/assets/icon/arrowdown.svg. And then that we'll use that as a component. Just going to say arrow there. And then my second button is going to be the Let's Connect button. So I'm going to wrap my text for that in a span tag, Let's Connect. And then within that, we're also going to have our emoji. So I'm going to wrap that in a span tag as well, just for positioning purpose, and go ahead and just select that with my emoji keyboard. On a Mac, that is Control Command Spacebar to bring up that emoji selector. That's how I would select that. If you have to go online and copy and paste that, feel free to do that as well. Now that we have our content on the page, we can start to style up this section. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give a little bit of padding top and bottom to this section. So I'm going to start out with my padding. PY32 should give me 120 padding top and bottom. Now that looks a little strange. It looks like it actually pushed too much padding into the section. So let's see that after we change the size of our image. So the image, I believe, is going to be about 100 pixels. So I'm going to say class name here, and I'm going to go size. And I don't think Tailwind has a direct 100 pixels, so I'm going to just have to say 100 pixels here, and that should set that to the right size. We can also see that this banner is going to be moved towards the center of the page, so I'm going to have to wrap both the image and the banner itself in a div, and go ahead and set that to a flexed container with the class name of flex, and flex call should push it top to bottom. And then if I say items center, that should center the content of that flexed container. The next thing I'm going to work on is the outer part of this banner. So I'm going to have a class name here, and we're going to say BG gray 950 for the background. We also need a border. So I'm going to say border, and then border gray 800 should be the border color. For the padding left and right, we're going to say PY4. And for the padding top, PX4, and for the padding top and bottom, we're going to say PY 1.5 for 6 pixels of padding top and bottom. We also want this to be flexed as well, so I'm going to say flex right now, just so we make sure we take care of that. The text looks a little bigger than the design, as well as it's a little thin. So I'm going to say class name here, and I'm going to say text small. That should make it smaller. And we also want it to be font semi-bold. That looks a little thick, so I'm going to say font medium. That should thin it up. We also need to style our dots. So I'm going to say class here, and that is going to have a green background. So I'm going to say BG green 500 to give it that green background. We need to give it a size. So I'm going to say size 2.5 to give it 10 pixels of size. And then border radius, we're going to set that with rounded full, and that should give that the border radius that we need. Now this does show us that we don't have anything aligned in our flex container. So I'm going to say items center in our flex container. That should align it to the center. And then we need some sort of gap in between here and the text. So I'm going to say gap 4, and that should give it the proper gap. I also need some border radius. So I'm going to say rounded large, and that should give it some borders around this particular section. Now, if we overlay our design, we can see if we got this exactly right. So I'm going to come to my reference image and overlaid, and then we can see if it looks exactly right. In fact, we can even go up here and say difference so that it will highlight the differences for us. And I'm not seeing anything being highlighted right here, which means I think we're exactly right on our design. I'm going to pull that back out to the side by pushing it back to side by side. Now that we've done that, let's move on to our title. So I'm going to give this a class name, and we know that this text is going to be our serif font. So I'm going to say font serif here. And then we also know that it's going to be bigger. So we're just going to start with text 2XL and see how that looks. It's not quite big enough. Let's go with 3XL. That should be the right size. We also want to center the text with text center to make sure that it's in the center of the screen. And we know that it needs to move down as well. So I'm going to start with MT4 and see if that's enough. It doesn't quite look like enough. Let's try 8 if that's the right amount. And it does look like the right amount. Let me go ahead and position my design right on top of my code again and see if that looks perfect according to the design. And it doesn't look like it's quite right. So I'm actually going to switch this to overlay style normal. But you can see that there's a little bit of difference between the design and this text, and that's because we have some letter spacing differences. So I'm going to say tracking wide and see if that's the right size, and it does look like that is what was going on there. Let me push my design back to the side and continue with our description. So in my description, I'm going to say class name equals, and we know that we're going to have some margins. So let's do MT4 for that. Hopefully that pushes it down enough. We also know that's going to be text center to center the text, and then it's going to be lightened up. So I'm going to use text white 60 to lighten that text up. Moving down to our buttons, we know that they need to be flexed top and bottom. So I'm going to give this a class name of flex and flex call. That should flex them top to bottom. And we know that our arrow down needs to be a lot smaller. So I'm going to go ahead and give that a class name of size 4. That should bring the size of that down. Our buttons also need to be inline flexed. So I'm going to say class name equals inline flex, and that should position them side by side with the icons and the text. In order to align our text and our icons to the center, I'm going to say items center. And I also want to give it a little bit of gap between that. So I'm going to say gap 2. That should give the proper gap there. We also know that we are going to need a border around this. So I'm going to say border and border white 15. That should be the proper border. And our flex container right now is flexing to the column direction, but it's not pushing our items to the center properly. So I'm going to say items center here, and that should push this flex container towards the center. For our padding left and right, we're going to use px6. And then for the height of the button, we're going to make it 48 pixels tall with h12. We also want theirs to be some border radius. So we're going to say rounded XL, and that will add some border radius to the left and right. And of course, the text itself isn't quite right. So I'm going to say class name equals font semi-bold, and let's see if that is the right font weight. And it does indeed look like it is. Let's go ahead and move these buttons down a little bit from our content with MT8 on our wrapper container. And let's then work on our second button, and then we can overlay the design and see if we got it exactly right. So for our second button, we're going to say class name here, and we're going to use a lot of our styles from before. So we're certainly going to use inline flex. We want our items to go to the center. We want there still to be a gap 2. I don't know if we want a border on this or not. I think we still do. So we'll say border, but the border is going to be white in this case. And then we want the background to be white, so BG white. We also want the text color to be the text gray 900. That will allow it to be the right text color. We want the font to be semi-bold, so class name equals font. Oops, I want that to be down below there. So let's go back. We want the font to be semi-bold, so I'm going to say class name equals font semi-bold there. And then we want there to be some padding top and bottom and left and right. So we can use that same H12 to give it that 48 pixels tall, and then PX6 should give it the right padding left and right. We can also use the border radius rounded XL, and that should give it the right border radius as well. We know that we want this to be split between these two buttons. So I'm just going to take my flex container here and say gap 4, and hopefully that's the right level of spacing between those two. So let's see if we got this right. Let me go take my design image, and I'm going to overlay this again and see if it is a pixel perfect fit. And indeed it is. So this has been exactly pixel perfect to the design so far. The mobile view doesn't yet have the rings or the stars that you can see in the design, but that's okay because we are going to worry about that when we get to our desktop version of this section. So let's go ahead and move over to the tablet version, and let's see what's different over there. And it looks like there's still quite a bit of difference in our tablet version. So let's go ahead and pull our image over to side by side so that we can see what's actually different. One of the things that's different is we certainly have a difference in padding on the top and bottom with our image versus what we're seeing on the design. So let's go ahead and add that in to our hero section. So we're going to come up here where it says PY32, and we're going to say when it gets to the medium size, we're going to say PY48. That should take care of the padding difference. We also have a font size difference as well. So that's going to be the H1. That's going to be a different font size when we get up to this tablet size. So let's use medium here as a modifier and say text 5XL. Hopefully that'll be the right font size that we see here. It looks like we also have a little bit of a difference in the max size or some sort of container around the content whenever we get to this tablet size. So let's see if we can add that in as well around all of our content. So right now we have this as part of our content. We also have our heading and our paragraph, and then we have our buttons. So I'm just going to add this container right now around our H1 and our P, because those are really the content pieces that are going to flow outside and be too wide for our design. So I'm going to go ahead and create a div right here, and I'm going to put the ending div right after our paragraph. And then for this one, we're going to say class name equals, and then we're going to give it a max width. So I'm going to say max width large, and that should give it a max of 512 pixels. Let me save that. And it looks like that does about do it, but of course it's not in the center of the screen. So let me say MX Auto, and that should give the margin left and right the auto CSS rule that they need. The font size for the description is also a little bit different, so it seems like we need to bump that up as well. So I'm going to say here we have this as the base font size. Let's go ahead and flip that in the medium screen size to text large and see if that looks like the design. And it looks like it does indeed look like the design. We also see that our buttons are now left and right. So let's go ahead and flip that around as well by taking this flex column container and then saying on the medium size, we're going to say flex row. That should put our buttons left and right. We'll need to put this in the center of the screen as well with justify center, and that should put the buttons in the center of the screen. This looks like it's very close to our design right now. So let's go ahead and overlay our design image and let's see if there are any differences that stand out. And it doesn't look like there are. So I'm going to go ahead and keep that actually overlaid as we go over to our desktop design, where we can see if we need to make additional changes. And it does indeed look like our desktop design has some additional changes that we need to make. So I'm going to pull out my browser window a little bit. I'm going to put my reference image over to the side, and let's see what else we need to take care of. So one of the things we need to take care of is, of course, our padding top and bottom once again just gets increased. So let's go ahead up to the top of our hero section and give this a large modifier. And we'll say there, we're going to say have a padding top and bottom of 60, which should give it 240 pixels top and bottom. That looks like it's now correct. I'm not seeing any other things that look like they've changed right offhand, but it'll be a lot easier to tell once we overlay the design on top of our code. And it does look like nothing has changed with the content part of this section. Now that we've taken care of the content part of the hero section, it's time for us to go over the different effects that really make this section pop. So if I pull out my design to a side-by-side view and we look at that, we can see that there are a couple of layers. So underneath everything, there is a grain layer. That's just giving a little bit of a grain effect to these rings here. And then you have the rings that are on top of that layer. And then on top of those rings, you have stars. So we're going to take care of all three of those layers by positioning those different things absolutely over under our content. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and slide my browser window back over a little bit so it gives us a little bit more room to see our code. And then we're going to make sure that we're importing our grain layer. So I'm going to import my grain image, and that's going to be from @assets/images/grain.jpg. And then we're going to position it underneath all of our content. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to make the outer wrapper relative, and that's going to allow me to drop a positioned absolute div in here. So I'm going to say class name equals absolute inset 0 will make it as big as the relative container. And then for our style, we're going to basically say the background image is going to be equal to a URL of grain image.source. And that should make the background be that grain image that we've imported. Now, if we go over to our newly updated portfolio site, we can see that that's not looking too great. And that's perfectly fine. We just need to put the grain underneath everything, and then we need to reduce the opacity a lot so that you don't see it very much at all over the background. So the first thing we're going to do is create a Z index on our relative container. So I'm going to say Z0, that's just going to reset the index, the Z index, and that's going to allow us to basically give this a negative index so that it falls below everything else. So I'm just going to give this a negative Z, let's just say 30, and that should make it come below all of our content. And then the only other thing that we need to do there after that is done is ensure that our grain image also has a very light opacity. So I am going to also do that with opacity 5, and that should give that a 5% opacity to where you can barely see it. And in fact, you won't really be able to see it until we start adding our rings on top of that grain pattern. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and add in our rings on top of that grain pattern. So we're going to have another set of absolutely positioned rings. So I'm going to go ahead and create the first one of those. I'm going to say div class name equals absolute inset 0. And this is going to be the first innermost ring. It looks like it's going to have a height and width of about 620 pixels. So let's say size, and then I'm going to give it a custom value of 620 pixels. We're also going to give this a border. So we're going to say border 2 to give that a border with a width of 2. In order to move it to the center of the page, we need to say top 1/2, left 1/2. And then we need to pull it back with a translation. So I'm going to say negative translate x 1/2, negative translate y 1/2, and that will actually pull it back towards the center of our section. In order to make it an actual circle, we can give it a 9999 pixel border radius, and that's going to be with rounded full to give it that 100% border radius. Of course, it's not white, it's actually a very light emerald 300 color. So we're going to give this a border emerald 300/5, 5% opacity. So very, very light. And then we're also going to say that it has an inner shadow as well. So we're going to give it a shadow of 0, 0, 80 pixels. So it doesn't move any in the X or the Y direction, but it does have 80 pixels of blur, and it's also inset. So those are the things that are added there. And then to give it the right color, we're going to say shadow emerald 300/5 again for 5% opacity on that shadow. That should take care of our ring. And as you probably noticed, all the next rings are going to have almost the exact same styles. The only thing that's really going to change is the size of the ring. So we can actually take this and we can make sure that it is put in a utility class in order to be able to use this class again instead of rewriting all of these styles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut all of these styles that we've created here, and I'm going to come into my directory and I'm going to go to my globals.css, and then we're going to add this in the base layer. So we're going to say hero ring, and then we're going to apply all the class names that we've given here. So it's essentially going to apply absolute, our inset 0, our border 2, top left, our translation, our border radius, the colors, the shadows, all of that will be applied with this hero ring class. And that's what we'll go ahead and save that. And then we'll come back into our hero and we'll say hero ring. And that should apply the same styles. You shouldn't see any change over here after we save both of those. That will just work. So that means that we can go ahead and apply another hero ring just by going ahead and giving this the same classes and then just changing the size. So the next one's going to go up to an 820 pixel ring. So we'll go ahead and add that. The next one is going to go to a 1020 pixel ring. So we'll copy and paste that into a 1020 pixel ring. And then the final one is going to be 1220 pixels. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste that and make that our 1220 pixels. Now let's go ahead and scoot this over a little bit just so we can get a little bit of a better view. I know it's kind of hard to see because it's such a light effect, but it really shines. The rings really add just another level of depth to this hero section. What I'll do now is I'll just go ahead and double check that our rings are in the right position by overlaying the design on top of our rings. So I'm going to go ahead and switch this to overlaid again, and you can see that you're not seeing any difference in the way that the rings are aligned in the design versus what we have in our current code. So that is working very well. In fact, if we switch over to difference, we should be able to see that essentially we don't have much difference here at all, except for, of course, our stars, which are quite a bit different between the two designs. The last thing we'll do in this section before we move forward on to the next one is to go ahead and add our stars. So I'm going to move this back to side by side, and this shows us that we just have our rings. I think we can move the section content a little bit side to side, so I want to ensure that we don't have any problems with that. So I'm going to say overflow x clip, and that should clip things to make sure that we don't have any way to scroll side to side. And I think that took care of that problem. Back looking at our design, we see that the third layer that we have to add to this hero section is these stars. Now, what makes these stars so complex? They normally wouldn't be, because we could just position them absolutely outside the content and tell them how much to offset and they would be fine. But we want to prepare them for the animation that we're going to eventually do to rotate them not only independently around themselves, but also have them orbit the header. And that's really where the complexity of these stars is going to come from. So let's go ahead and talk about how we're going to implement these so that we can handle both of those cases. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and bring in my star icon and actually get it onto the page. So I'm going to import my star icon from @assets/icons/star.svg, and that will give me my star. And then of course I'm going to position it absolutely. So I'm going to say div class name equals absolute, and we'll go ahead and also put the star icon inside of that. So star icon, and then go ahead and save that and see where it shows up. Now it's showing up right here on the left-hand side. So let me go ahead and at least make sure it has the right color and size, and then we'll worry about how we're going to position it inside of our hero section. So I'm going to say class name equals, and I'm going to say size 28. That should make it big enough. And then we're going to say text emerald 300, and that should make it the right color, since this is an SVG that takes the fill color from the text color. In order to position it towards the center of the page, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to use this wrapper container to get it towards the center of the page. So I'm going to use the same technique that I used before. I'm just going to say left 1/2, top 1/2, and then negative translate X 1/2, negative translate Y 1/2, and that should get it towards the center of the page, which of course it does. Now, in order to see this box, I'm going to go ahead and give it a red border. So I'm going to say border red 500, and that should give it a red border that we see here. And we also want another box around our star, and I'll show you why in a second, because we want 2 axes for it to be able to rotate around. So I'm going to say div class name equals, and we're going to also give this one a border. So border and border red 500, just so that we can see how these are working together. Now the first box, the outer box, is actually going to set the size of our orbit. So what I mean by that is it's going to set the distance from the center of the hero. So let's go ahead and give this a size of 800 pixels. So I'm going to say size, I'm going to give this a custom value of 800 pixels. That should give it a height and width of our 800 pixels. Then after we've given that the size of 800 pixels, I want to make sure that this is inline flex, because I only want it to wrap around the star itself. So I'm going to say inline flex here, and hopefully that will just wrap it around the star itself. So you can see that we have this big box, and then we have a little box inside of it. This gives us a lot of options about what we do and how we rotate this star. So first of all, I'm going to show you how we would rotate the star itself by going ahead and giving an animation to this outer box. So let me show you this real quick. So I'm going to say animate spin and save that. And you can see that we have that animation there. And just to slow this down a little bit, I'm also going to give this a custom animation duration. So I'm going to say animation duration of, let's just say 5 seconds. And hopefully that will slow that down a bit, which it does. And then to rotate our outer box, as in an orbit around our hero section, we can also give this an animation of spin. So I'm going to say animate spin. And the same thing is true here. I'm going to say animation duration, and let's just give this a 30-second duration, just so it goes nice and slow for us. So let's go ahead and do that. And you can see that is starting to change, but it's not changing the way that we want it to. And that's essentially because we have 2 things at play right here. The animation will try and do some transforms, and these translates are also trying to do transforms. So we have to separate those layers out a little bit and put those on separate layers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these rules right here, the size, the animate, the border, and I'm going to put it inside of our absolute box. So I'm going to put that right here. So div class name equals, and just copy and paste those same rules inside of there, and then go ahead and paste that inside of here. Okay, and now we have essentially an orbit, which is being handled by this, a centering, which is being handled by this layer, and then an individual rotation and animation that's being handled right here. So these 3 things together are eventually going to handle the entire animation of our stars. This outer positioning box, then we have an inner size box, an orbit box I would call it, and then inside of that we have the individual wrapper that's going to animate our element itself, and then we have the actual element itself. Now, wouldn't it be great if we could go ahead and create a component out of this so that we could use this time and again and not have to think about all the rules that we have to create in order to make this work. And that's, of course, exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and create a component out of this, but first I'm going to take off the animation because we're not worried about animation right now. We're going to come back to that in the future. So we'll go ahead and take off those animations, and then we're going to put all of this inside of a component in order to make this very reusable. In order to do that, let me go ahead and slide my browser window over a little bit so that we get some more space to work with. I'm going to open up my sidebar and go into my components folder. In this case, I'm going to call this a hero orbit is what I'm going to call it. So I'm going to go ahead and give a new file here. I'm going to call this hero orbit.tsx. And for that hero orbit, I'm going to export a const of hero orbit, and we're going to make that return the JSX that we have inside of our hero. So I'm gonna go ahead and take all of this, copy it, and bring it over to our hero orbit and just paste it right into here. Now, of course, what we put in the center, we're going to make the children of this component. So it's just going to have essentially a slot for us to drop a child into there, and that's going to make sure that it is created the way that we want it to be. So let me go ahead and do that. Let me go ahead and bring in our children prop. And in order to make TypeScript recognize that, we can just say props with children from React, and that will allow us to use that. And then we'll just go ahead and cut this and just make that say children. And that will be the slot where we'll stick that child. The other thing that we're going to want to be able to control from outside this as a prop is, of course, we're going to want to be able to set the size of the orbit container itself. So this size right here, we're going to want to be able to control it from outside of the component. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a size prop, and that size, we're going to go ahead and make that with TypeScript. That size is going to be a number is fine, and we can go ahead and insert that in here. So what we'll do is we'll say the style of this is going to be equal to height, and that's going to be size pixels. And then we're also going to do the same thing with width. So width is going to be equal to size pixels. And then we don't have to put this size 800 pixels here anymore. We can just let the component, the user of the component, control the size of the hero orbit. So I'm going to save that. And for now, this is going to be all we're going to do with this component. So I'm going to come back into my hero, and I'm going to use my hero orbit component. So I'm going to just say hero orbit and wrap that around my star icon, which is going to be the children. And right now it's going to say, yes, you should have a size prop, which of course I know. So I'm going to say size equals 800, and that's going to be the height and width of this container. The other thing we're going to want to be able to do is rotate this container as well. So the way that we're going to position, let me pull out this again and I'll kind of give an example here, but the way that we're going to position this star around where it's supposed to be in this orbit is with some rotation. So if I were to take this hero orbit right now, let's go in here and let's just do a simple rotation. So let's take this div, for example, and let's just say rotate 6. You can see that now it's rotated 6 degrees, and the same thing is true of 12, or I could rotate that 45 degrees. And so that's how we're going to handle exactly where the position is supposed to be. So we essentially have two things going on here. We have size and we have rotation that's going to get it into the position that it needs to be in order for it to get to the right spot. So that also means that we're going to have another prop to be able to set what degree rotation this should be at. So I'm going to say rotation, and that's going to be a prop as well. So it's got to be in here in TypeScript's definitions. So rotation, in fact, we can just put this like this. So number, rotation is also a number. It's going to be required. And then we're going to rotate this center one by the rotation that we have right here. So I'm going to say rotate, instead of rotate 45, we're going to say the style is going to be transform. And then we're going to say rotate, and that's going to be whatever that rotation is, rotation degrees. And that's going to tell it how far to rotate. Now, as soon as we save that, we of course don't have a rotation inside of our hero.tsx. So this is going to throw an error and say, hey, you need rotation. We know that, of course. So we'll say rotate just to test this out, and we'll say 45 and see if that, or excuse me, rotation 45, and we'll see if that works. And indeed it does, which means that now we just have to figure out what our rotation should be for this particular orbit. The easiest way I can think to do that is to go ahead and overlay our design on top, and then we'll rotate this box until it lines up with this right here. So let's see if we can do -45 and see where it's at. Okay, so -55, it's getting closer, 65, 75. So I'm a little bit past, let's try 70, 1 or 2. And 72 looks like it's it. The difference though is that we also have the star inside that doesn't change position. We want it to be perfectly upright given the rotation that we've given it. So essentially we need to have the outer layer rotating, and then the inner layer needs to have a rotation that's exactly the opposite to get it back to being directly upright. So we can do that. We can come inside of our hero orbit, and we just need to rotate this layer exactly the opposite of whatever this rotation is right here. So let's try that. So we give this a style, and we'll give this a transform, and that's going to say rotate rotation times -1 degrees. And let's see if that enables it to be there. That is almost perfect. The only thing that's making it a little bit different is basically the fact that we have the extra size of the borders themselves. So the borders are actually adding 1 pixel each, and that's actually offsetting this star so that it isn't in perfect position. So there's a couple of things we could do here. I mean, I was just trying to explain this to you. That's why I have the borders in there in the first place. So let's see if we take those borders off, if the star actually lines up perfectly. So let me go ahead and save that without that first border, and let's save that without that second border, and let's see where that aligns our star. And that looks like it's exactly in perfect position. So now we know exactly what we need to do. For each of these stars, we essentially need to know the size of the orbit, and then we need to know the rotation that we need to rotate the star so that it lines up with the star that's in our design. And of course, we need to know the size of the star itself. So all those things, 3 things are going to come into play to allow us to get these stars all in alignment with our design. Okay, so let's go back into our hero.tsx and let's add another star. So I'm going to add another hero orbit, and we're going to try and get this star here at the top. This is going to be the one that we're going to try and use here. So it looks like the size of this is about 550 pixels. So I'm going to say size equals 550, and the rotation, we'll see what it here is here in a second. The star icon itself, we're going to have a class name of size 12, it looks like. And of course, we all do want to have that text emerald 300 to make sure that it's the right color. And then for rotation, for now, we're just going to say 0 because we're not sure exactly what that's going to be yet. So let's see where that's placed. It looks like it's placed over here, so it's not too far off. Let's go ahead and start rotating it and see if we can get it in the right position. So 10, let's try 15. Okay, not quite. Try 20. And it looks like 20 degrees is the rotation that we needed for that particular star. So that one is in location. So we had size, we had rotation, the size of the star itself. All those we were able to use in order to get that one lined up. So the third one is going to be over to the right side. That's going to be this little one over here. It looks like it is a size of 32 pixels, and the size of the orbit looks like it's about 590 pixels. So let's go ahead and copy and paste this orbit right here, and let's create our third star. And we're going to go ahead and give that the 590. And rotation, once again, is going to be 0 for now until we find out what that is. And then for this one, it's going to be 8 for our 32 pixel size. So we can see that that's located right here right now. We want to get it all the way over to here. So let's start rotating it and see what happens. Let's start with 45 now, because we know it's going to be pretty far. And let's try 90 to get it over a little bit closer. That looks like it's getting very close. So let's give it 100, and we're a little past. So let's go ahead and come down. So 98. And it looks like 98 degrees is exactly where we need that to be. The size is right, the size of the orbit is right. And so that looks like our third star is now in location. The next few orbits are going to be our sparkles. So let's go ahead and pull this design out one more time so that we can have a better look at it and scroll over. So these right here, these are the sparkles. So they're a little bit different than the stars because they don't have those curved interior. So you can see how it has this curved interior right here. The sparkles have this kind of straight edge, and then the splines come out. I don't know exactly what you call those, but we'll call them splines. Those come out from that. So that's what's happening with these sparkles. Now there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different ones of these. So we're going to start with the interior ones and see if we can take care of those. And then we'll move on to these exterior ones as well. There's another difference in these in that they're going to have some opacity. So these regular stars were full color, but now these ones are going to have some opacity so that they kind of show through the background a little bit. So these aren't going to be quite as in your face as our normal stars are. So we'll take care of all that in our code. We know that we're still going to need hero orbits. So that's going to work the same way. The only difference is now instead of bringing in a star icon and giving it a color of Emerald 300, we're going to bring in the sparkle icon and we're going to give it a color of Emerald 300 with an opacity of 20. So it's going to be a little bit different there. So let's first bring in our sparkle icon and see if we can get that on the page. We go ahead and import sparkle icon from @/assets/icon/sparkle. And then we're going to go ahead and put that inside of a hero orbit and just see how it shows up. So go ahead and put sparkle icon. Looks like we can go ahead and leave the size as 8 for this one. We're going to have the orbit be 430 pixels. So it's definitely going to be a smaller orbit than our last one. So let's see how this shows up right away. We should see a nice bright one over here as we're looking. So I think this one right here, set the rotation back to 0 as well. And go ahead and save that again. And then let's go ahead and overlay the design because I really want to see which one we're targeting so that we can see when we get our rotation perfect. And it looks like this is the one that's we're actually targeting right here. So we need to pull our sparkle back so that it aligns right over here. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to set the rotation to -20. And that was too much. So let's try -15 and see how close we get. We're almost there. Let's try -14. That looks like it's right there. And we're also seeing that it's definitely too bright. So let me try that with a /20 to give it the opacity that we need. It looks like that does do it with the right opacity. So that worked well. Let's go ahead and add another one to another orbit. So I'm going to go ahead and add another hero orbit with another sparkle icon. We'll set the rotation right now to 0. This one should be about 440 pixels. And let's see where we can line this one up. And it's also a size of 20 pixels, which means we're going to say size 5. It's even smaller. It looks like it's going to be this one right over here. So let's go ahead and see if we can rotate that over into the right position. So let's start with a rotation of 90 and see if that gets close. It's close. We got to come back a little bit. So let's come back to 80. We're really close. 79. 79 looks like that's the right rotation. It's the right color. It's the right size. So that one is taken care of. The third one we're going to want to do, I think, is this one down here. So let's see if we can get that one in place. Let's go ahead and add another orbit. This orbit is going to be 530 pixels, it looks like. So let's try and do 530. And for our starting rotation, we'll go ahead and leave it at 90 just so we can start to see. It looks like it's coming around right here. We're going to increase the size of that one. So it's going to be 40 pixels. So we'll use size 10 for that one. And then we'll just continue to rotate it. Let's try 180 and see how close that gets. And 180 is actually really close. Looks like it's a little bit past. Let's try 178 and see. And that looks like it's right on. So that's one right here. That's definitely right on the money. And then for our fourth sparkle, that's going to be the one that's over here. So let's go ahead and copy and paste this one more time and grab this with a size of 710. And this is also going to be a little bit bigger. So this one is going to say that it is 56 pixels. So definitely bigger. So we're definitely overshooting this one a bit. So let me pull this back to 150 and see how close we get with that. Okay, so that's pretty good. 148 maybe. 45 pulls it back even further. 43 overshot it. So 144 should be right on the money. And it looks like that is correct. Now we have all 4 sparkles on there. So that's number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. The only other thing that we have left to do is there's a couple of circles in our orbit as well. So I can see a circle up here to the right. It's kind of hard to see. A circle over here and a circle over here. So let me pull out the design so it's a little bit easier to see where those are at. And then I'm going to overlay them again just so we can get them in the right spot. So you can see a circle there, you can see a circle there, and we can see a circle there as well. So we'll need to put all of those in position. So let's go ahead and overlay our design one more time. And then we'll go ahead and start getting these circles in position. So we need hero orbits again, but instead of having the sparkle icon inside them, now we're just gonna have circles. And circles we can create without any kind of SVG at all. We can just use divs for those. So that's what I'm gonna do. So I'm gonna copy this over. I'm gonna change this rotation. Let's just start with 0 on this one. Let's make the size of the orbit 720 pixels. And then this one's just gonna be a div with a class name of, it's actually gonna be 12 by 12 pixels. So it's gonna be size 3. We're gonna have probably the same BG Emerald 300. And then we also want to ensure that we have rounded full for this. So we can, if we wanted to, we could create kind of a utility class to have these circles, but I don't think we're going to be repeating this enough, or there's going to be enough classes for that to warrant that. So I'm just going to leave this as is for now and see if we see that showing up anywhere on our page. And I do think I'm seeing it right here. Let's start rotating it and seeing if there's anywhere that we can put it. So let's give it a rotation of, let's just say 20. Okay, so it looks like it's actually the exterior one. It's this outer one right up here, and we're going to need to rotate it all the way past around the border of our page all the way over to here. So let's try this with actually at 90 degrees, and we overshot it by just a bit. So let's bring that back to 88 and then 86, and we're almost right on the money. 85. Looks like we're not quite getting there with this one. This one might be a little bit of a different size or rotation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back into my hero orbit. I'm going to add a couple of outlines in order for me to be able to see where my different boxes are. So I'm going to say outline. And the reason I'm using outline right now is because it doesn't take up any extra space like the border did. So it's not going to throw me for a loop and make it look like something is not working. That is a lot of outlines that we have there, but we know that what we're looking at is right up here. So this is the one that we're trying to see. And then the same thing is true for this. I'm going to say outline, outline 1, and then outline red 500. And that should hopefully show me what my internal box is doing. And it looks like it's not all the way over for some reason inside of my external box. It's very interesting to me because we have these divs, and I was expecting that they would always be to the very side of these different boxes. If that is the case, I wonder if we can add a flex rule here and get them to align. It doesn't look like that's the case unless we say items start and justify start, and that might push all of our items to the very top left of our boxes. And it does look like that works. So by flexing this container, we were able to get our circle to align exactly where we needed it to align in this hero orbit. So I'm going to take off my outlines again because we don't need those anymore. Those are more confusing than anything at this point, but we do have some additional classes that we'll leave on that will align our items in the right spots. And then when I do that, I can see that I've now lined up my circle perfectly. It was just a problem with the hero orbit that was causing the problem before. There's 2 more circles that we're going to need to place. One is going to be over here on the left, over towards the top left, and one is going to be more towards the center here. So let me see if we can get those in place, and then we will have these all in place to be able to take a look at our responsive designs and make sure we didn't mess anything up. So the first one I'm going to say 0 is going to be our rotation for now. We know that this is going to be a bit different. It's going to be 520 on our size of our orbit, and then the actual size of the circle is going to be 2. So that's going to make that smaller. So this is this right here. We're going to rotate that backwards until we hit this right here. So I'm going to say negative 45, and that almost, it overshot it by just a bit. So let's try 42, and we're getting closer, 41, and we're right on the money with 41. So that is where we want to put that one. And we'll copy and paste this one real quick and set this back to 0. Set the size to 650. It's a little bit bigger than our last orbit, and that is going to wind up right here. We just need to hit right to here. So I'm looking at negative 10 as a potential. Looks like we overshot that by a bit. So let's try negative 5, and that's right on the money. Looks like all of our orbits are now in place. That is a lot of orbits, but the nice thing about doing this with a repeatable component is that, of course, we didn't need to repeat this code every single time. That would have been really nasty to do. And of course, we were able to take in just a couple of props and then change the styles of our code to make that all work well. And of course, when it comes to the animation, that's also going to allow us to change all of our animations in one spot as well, to ensure that with a couple of props, we should be able to easily adjust how our animations work as well. Now that all that's done, let's go ahead and see if there's anything else we need to clean up from our design. So we're going to go back through all of the responsive views as we're seeing them side by side and kind of do a little bit of a check as we wipe over and see if there's anything that looks out of place. One of the things that I'm seeing as we go into the mobile view is it doesn't look like we can actually click any of our header items. And it almost looks like there's a star sitting on top of, in our coded design, the nav bar when it should be underneath. Now that is a definite difference, and I think that has to do with the Z index of our fixed navigation on the top. So let's go back into our header and let's see if we can give this a different Z index here up where it says fixed. So I'm going to give this a Z index of 10, and let's see if that brings it up above our star. And it looks like it does. So that is going to make this actually look like it is clickable, which is going to be what we want in our coded template. The other thing that I'm seeing as we get to the bigger views is these rings start to actually move out of the section itself and actually go into the next section. You can see that there's rings here, and as we scroll over with our view to see what the design actually has. So this is our coded on the left, and this is the actual design on the right. And I think that the design does not have the rings coming down into, actually, let me go ahead and make this reference image full opacity. So yeah, the coded or the design does not have the rings coming into the next section, but our version does. So we're definitely going to have to fade those out at the top and the bottom. So let me go ahead and figure out how we want to do that. That's probably going to be with a mask that we need to overlay this entire, anything that's in the background, we're going to want to overlay that with a mask. So over in our code, let's get out of our header section, come back to our hero, and then in our hero, we're going to want to wrap anything that would be in the background with a mask so that we can fade it out as we get to the bottom of our section. So let's see if we can do that. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and wrap all of our background items within a div. So I'm going to say div class name equals absolute inset 0. So that makes it the same size as everything else, or actually of this same size as the section. I'm going to wrap that ending div around our last hero orbit. So we have all of our hero orbits inside here. We have all of our rings inside here. We even have our grain effect inside of this one div, and that's going to allow us to control that div with a mask. So what we're going to say here is mask image, and we're going to give it a linear gradient, and it's going to go from top to bottom, and it's going to start at transparent. It's going to go to black at 10%. It's going to end at black at 70%. And then it's going to go to transparent again. So essentially, it's going to come in with a pretty quick fade, and then it's going to go out with a much smoother, longer fade from 70% to transparent again. So as soon as I save that, let's see as we pull over this tablet view a little bit what that shows. And so now you can see, instead of seeing the rings go all the way down, they're actually going to fade out at the bottom of the section. And that's exactly what we wanted to see from our coded template. So let me go ahead and change my reference image again, just to bring it down in opacity a bit so that we're seeing it with some different opacity. Let me go ahead and close that out and come over to my desktop design, make sure I'm seeing the same thing. So we do see that this section also looks like it now fades out at the bottom, and of course fades out a little bit at the top, just gives it a really nice effect. With that being done, I think we have wrapped up all of our hero section for all of our responsive designs, which means that we can move on to the next section. Back over in our design, now that we're moving past the hero section, let's look at what the next part we're going to have to do is, and that's going to be this featured projects section. And we're going to show 3 different featured projects with dates and companies and titles with a couple of checkboxes, and of course the button to visit the live site there. And that's going to be essentially what this featured projects section is going to hold. First, we're going to code it statically. So we're going to get it looking like this. And then when we come back and do our animations, that's where we're going to make it sticky and stick to the top of the page. But of course, in the design, we can't show that. So this is what this is going to do. Coming over into the tablet view, it's going to look a little bit different. The screen is definitely going to be a little bit bigger. The button is going to be aligned to the left, and our font sizes will have come up a little bit. So that'll be the difference in the tablet view. So you can see all of those top to bottom. And then in the desktop view, we switch our layout a little bit in this featured projects section. So you can see that now the screen will come over to the right, and we are going to have our content to the left. One minor thing about this section that you might notice is that this border is not a true border because it doesn't sit outside of our box. It actually sits inside of our box. And how I know that is if I zoom in, you can actually see the content of the card inside of the border, and you can actually see that it overlaps the content here as well. So this is actually going to be an outline, not a true border around these cards. It's going to be just an important detail that I just wanted to point out in the design that we're going to recreate in our code. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into our code. Back in our code, let's go ahead and hook up the featured projects section. So it looks like it's going to be this projects here, and it's going to be the projects section. So I'm going to come into my app/page.tsx and import my projects section from @/projects, and then I'm going to go ahead and bring that in here with project section, just adding it onto my page. As soon as we save that, we should be able to see that it's added projects section here. And of course, we don't want an overlay as we're working through our initial design. So I'm going to take my reference image and pull it off to side by side, and then just pull this out a little bit so that we can see what's going on in our coded template versus what we're seeing in our design to make sure that they match up very nicely. Once we're back in our project section, I'm going to close out my page.tsx because we're done there. And I'm going to also close out my sidebar to give my code a little more room. And then we're going to go ahead and get started. What you can see here is that I've already included the data for the portfolio projects here. So we don't need to include that. We're just going to have to go ahead and create the code for it. So starting in here, I'm going to erase my projects section. I'm going to create a container with div class name equals container to hold my content in from the sides of the page. And then inside that container, I know that I'm going to have a little eyebrow there. That eyebrow I'm going to create with a paragraph tag. It's going to say real world results. Below that eyebrow, I'm going to have the title of the section, which I'm going to create with a semantic h2 tag. We're going to say featured projects. And then below that, we're going to have the description for the section. And it's going to say, see how I transformed concepts into engaging digital experiences. I'm going to paste that into my paragraph here and delete the extra space and go ahead and see that is shown on the page. Below that, we're going to have our projects themselves. So for each project, we're going to have a div along with a div that's going to wrap all of them. So we're going to go ahead and create a div that's going to wrap all of them. And then we're going to map over our portfolio projects with a simple map function. So I'm going to say portfolio projects.map. And for each project, we're going to go ahead and display some data here. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a wrapping div. And then inside that div, of course, we'll want a key to ensure that we have everything lined up the way that React likes it to be. So we'll say project.title will be the key for each project. And then inside that, we're going to want to have some data. So inside that, we're going to have a div. In that div, we're going to have the company name. So we're going to say project.company. And of course, we're also going to have the year in there as well. So I'm going to say project.year. Those two are going to be in there, and we can wrap those in span tags so that we can ensure that we can split those and flex those together and wrap those in span tags to ensure that we have those so that we can style them later. Below that, we're going to have the title for the project. So I'm going to make that an H3, a semantic H3 tag. I'm going to say project.title, and that should put the title on all of those. And then below that title, we're going to want to have our checkboxes and our button, and eventually our image as well. So for our checkboxes, we're going to go ahead and give that a UL. And then for each of our checkboxes, we can map over our results and output the title of those. So we're going to say project.results.map, and then we'll say result to a separate li, and that list item will output the result.title. So we're going to say result.title, and that will ensure that we have all of those put in our page as content as well. Above that UL, we are going to have a horizontal rule that's just going to split the list and the H3. So I'm going to just go ahead and add that in. Just HR is our horizontal rule there. And then below that, we're going to have a button. So I'm going to just say button there, and that's going to say view live site. And that's also going to be wrapped in a link. And that link is going to come from our project as well. So project.link, and that's going to allow us to be able to see those. We also know that we're going to have an image below that. So I'm going to go ahead and use my next image by selecting it from here so that it gets imported. The source is going to be our project.image, and the alt tag will probably just be the project.title, and that should allow that image to show up for each of those. So we have our images, we have all of the information that we need, and then we need to figure out how we're going to style this section so that everything shows up like it should. Now that we have our content on the page, it's time to get to the styling. So the first thing I'm going to do is ensure that our real world results shows up like it should. So I'm going to give this a class name, and we know that there's a couple things we're going to need to do this. One is going to be transform it to uppercase. So I'm going to say uppercase here. We also know that we're going to make it bold or semi-bold. It looks like that is going to be semi-bold. So we're going to say font semi-bold to make it the right font weight. We want that to also have a wider letter spacing. So it's going to be tracking widest to give it the right letter spacing. And in order to make this show up as a gradient in the background, we're going to say BG gradient to right, and we're going to say from emerald 300 to sky 400, and that will make our BG gradient show up. And then we need to say text transparent, and then we can say BG clip text, and that should enable our gradient to just be around our text. The problem with doing it the way that we've just done this is, even though we can say text center and get the text to the center of the page, we have a problem because our gradient doesn't go from all the way to the left to the R over to the S. It actually extends the entire way across the screen, which is just going to make the gradient look like it isn't that pronounced when we get a wider screen. So what we want to be able to do is we just want to be able to flex this paragraph towards the center of the screen so that we can ensure that the gradient is just wrapping the words and not under the entirety of the screen itself. So what I'm going to do that is just ensure that we have that working by going ahead and removing our clip text and text transparent to see where that gradient actually is. And then I'm going to wrap this paragraph in a div, and I'm going to flex that div. I'm going to say class name equals flex, and then we're going to say justify center. So that should make sure that the gradient is only wrapping the words. And then once we've done that, we can add in our BG clip text and text transparent again, and that'll ensure that the gradient is very pronounced in the real world results eyebrow. Below that, we have our title, so we need to go ahead and add our art styles to this as well. So I'm going to give this a class name. We know that the font is going to be serif. It's going to be our title font. The text size is obviously going to come up, so I'm going to say text 3XL, and hopefully that's the right size. Looks like it is. Our text is going to be centered on the screen, and we also know that we're going to have some margin to push it down. So I'm going to say MT6 for our 24 pixels of margin. That should push that down. Below that is our description. So let's go ahead and give this a class as well. We are going to make sure that it is centered with text center. We also want to ensure that it is a little bit lighter. So I'm going to say text white 60, and that's going to be that 60% opacity. And we're also going to give this some margin, MT4 for 16 pixels of margin to push it down from our featured projects title. Moving beyond that, we have our cards for each of our projects. So this is going to be a little bit trickier than just our eyebrow and our title, but let's see how we can style these to ensure that they are properly styled. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and give our wrapping div a class name of flex call that will ensure that we have full control of the spacing between. And of course we want some margin on the top of this as well. So I'm going to say MT 10, and let's see if that moves it down enough. It looks like it does for now. Then moving into our card itself, let's go ahead and give this a class name. And we know that this is going to have a lighter background. So this is going to be a BG Gray 800 instead of 900. That's just going to give it that lighter background. It's also going to have some border radius. So that's going to be a rounded 3XL. We already talked about the fact that we're going to have an outline inside all of these cards. That's going to be this lighter outline that you see over here on our design. So we can use an after element, or an after pseudo element, I should say, in order to create that outline. In order to do that, we'll say that this is going to be relative so that we can absolutely position that after pseudo element. So this is relative, and then we're going to say after content, and then we're going to give this an empty string. That's just going to make sure that we can actually use this and style this. We're going to say that that after element is also going to be positioned absolute. So after absolute, it's also going to be the size of our card. So after inset 0, we'll make it the full size of the card. And then to just make sure that we have it in position, what we're going to do is we're going to say after BG red 500, and hopefully we should see it over the entire thing, which of course we do right now. Now we want it to actually be underneath of our content. So that means that we have to give this a reset Z index. So I'm going to say Z0 to kind of Z index, and then we're going to say after negative Z10, and hopefully that'll pull it underneath of our content, which it does, which is perfect. That's exactly what we wanted to happen here. We also want our card to go ahead and kind of our overflow. So I'm going to say overflow hidden to ensure that our overflow is hidden from any absolutely positioned element, which of course this one is. So now that we know that this is showing up correctly, we can just go ahead and start styling it. And we're going to take off our BG red 500 and go ahead and save that again so that we can start styling this. Now we're going to give this a outline of 2 pixels. So we're going to say outline 2, and after outline as well, just to make sure the outline shows up. And then we're going to say after negative outline offset 2 to bring it inside of our card, which we can see that it has done. And then we also have to give it the same border radius as our card. So that's the rounded 3XL. So we need to set our after element to rounded 3XL. So let's see if we can word wrap this. I'm going to transform my word wrap, or toggle my word wrap, so we can see all these classes, so we can ensure that we don't mess anything up. So we can see we have our after negative offset. We can see that it is rounded 3XL. And now we just have to add the right color to our outline. So that's going to be our after outline white /20, and that'll be white with 20% opacity. So that looks like our outline is doing what we want it to do right now. When I look at this again, what I realize is that we actually don't want our outline to sit under the content. We want our outline to sit over our content so that the outline comes over our image on the bottom of our card. So that's a very important distinction. So let's see if we can actually set, instead of negative Z10, let's go ahead and give that Z10, and that should make it sit above our content, which indeed it does. Now that we've styled our outline, let's move on to actually styling the content inside of our card. So the first thing I'm going to do is style our Acme Corp 2022. This is going to have styles very similar to our eyebrow here. So let's flex this to the left to make sure that our gradient gets over the entire words and not just over the entire line. So I'm going to give this another wrapping div. That div is going to be what holds our background gradient. So class name equals BG gradient to right from emerald 300 to sky 400. And then we're going to flex that to the start. So I'm going to just say class name equals flex. That should ensure that our background gradient is just held to the words themselves. And then inside of this container here, I'm going to say inline flex to make sure that we can control spacing between our different words. And then we're also going to set all of our font weights and font sizes right here as well. So I'm going to say that it is font bold. Our of course is going to be uppercase. We know that. We also know that the tracking is going to be a little bit wider. So it's going to be tracking widest. So we're going to make sure that that is there. And it's going to be a little bit smaller. So it's going to be text small. to ensure that it's as small as it should be. And we can also see that we have a little dot in between here as well. So we're going to go ahead and add another span in between, and we're going to add a bool for bullet, and that should add the dot in between. And then we just need to make sure that we're using this inline flex to add a gap in between all of these with the appropriate spacing. So I am going to say that that is going to be gap 2, and that should position those as it should be. And then we just need to make sure that our background is clipped to our text so that we have gradient text. So I just need to say text transparent and then BG clip text, and that should make sure that our text has the gradient instead of the background itself. It's a little bit annoying right now that we haven't added any padding to our card. Our content is still hitting up against the side of our card. So let's see what we can add there to ensure that we have the right padding on our card. Let's add 32 pixels of padding on our card, and let's see if that matches our design. It looks like it does. We'll wait until we have it overlaid to make sure, but of course that padding looks good right now. And then down in my title, I want to go ahead and make sure that that is styled up as well. So I'm going to say class name. This is of course going to be font serif to give us the right font there. The size has to come up. So we're going to say text 2XL to ensure that the size comes up. And we also want to say MT2 to give it 8 pixels of margin above. And let's see if it is aligned. And it looks like it is aligned. For a horizontal rule, our horizontal rule, I believe, has a top border to it. So I'm going to increase the size of that. I'm going to say class name equals border T2. That should increase the size of that to 2 pixels. And then I'm just going to make sure that it is the right color. So I'm going to say border white /5, and that'll just make it 5% opacity. And then I'm going to add a margin top to that as well. So the horizontal rule is going to have MT4 for 16 pixels of padding on the top. For our list items, we didn't add any of these checkboxes over here, and of course we're going to have to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap these in a span tag so that we can put beside them an icon. That's going to be that check icon, and I'm going to go to the top of my file and I'm going to say import check icon from @/assets/icons/check circle, and that's going to be the check icon that we need. I'm going to rename that to check circle icon just to be more descriptive there. Copy that and bring this down here so that we can put this right here. So I'm going to have my check circle icon right beside my content of my list items. That's way too big. We knew that was going to be the case, or at least I suspected that was going to be the case. So to bring that down to its 20 pixel size, I'm going to say class name equals size 5, and that should bring that down. Each of these list items is going to flex the icon next to the text. So I'm going to say class name equals flex, and that should flex it next to the text. The text itself is going to have a gap of 2 between the content and the icon, and then we want to ensure that the text is the right size. So let me see if I can add a text small here to bring that down just a little bit. And that looks like it does do the trick. And we want it to be a little bit lighter as well. So I'm going to say text white 50, and that's just going to be a little bit lighter. Now the entire list item also needs flexed in the column direction so that we can control the spacing between the items themselves. So I'm going to say flex call, and then I'm going to add in a gap of 4 for 16 pixels between them, and then I want a little bit of top margin as well. So I'm going to say MT4, and that should add the 16 pixels of top margin that I need. So let me see if that lines up, and it looks like it does. For the button, let's go ahead and add styles to that as well. So I'm going to give this a class name, and that's going to be BG white. We know that the text is going to be probably a gray 950, if not 900. So let's add that as well. And then we want to ensure that it has the similar styles that we had before. So H12 is going to make it the right height. We're going to have it width full to make it the full width. We want it to be rounded on the edges with rounded XL. And we want to ensure that it's also the right font weight. So font semi-bold should do the trick there. And it also has another icon that we haven't imported into this file. So I'm going to go up to the top again and import my arrow up right icon from @/assets/icon/arrow up right, and that will ensure that we can import that into our button. And we need to wrap our text in a span tag so that we can control it next to our arrow up right icon that we're about to drop into that. that icon should be a little bit smaller. So I'm going to say class name equals size 4 to make it 16 by 16. And then we can just inline flex this button to make sure that it's flexed side to side. Items, center, justify, center to get it in the right spot. And then we're just going to give a small gap of 2 to ensure that our arrow sits at the right spot next to our icon. Now, if I give this a little bit of margin top, that'll ensure that it gets to the right spot in the card. So if I say MT8, that should move it down, and I'm just going to go ahead and look at that side by side, and that looks like it's exactly in the right spot. And then for the image, I need to add a little bit of margin to that as well. So I'm just going to give this a class name of MT8 and see if that does the trick. And let me just look at this side by side. It looks like my image is in the right spot, but of course the image itself has a little bit of an issue because it should be all the way to the bottom of this card. So what we could do in this particular case is go ahead and remove the bottom padding from this card. So instead of P8, we could use PL8 and PR8 and PT8, and that should do the trick. So let me just see if that works, and then we'll move on from there. So I'm going to say PX8 actually for the X direction, and then PT8 for the top, and that should remove it from the bottom, then putting our image right on the bottom of the card. Now, interestingly enough, in our design, we actually have, it looks like a little bit of negative margin that pulls our image down from the bottom of the card and actually off of the card. So let's see if we can replicate that in our code. So I'm going to say MT8 and then negative MB for negative bottom margin. Let's just start with 4 and see if that pulls that up as much as we want it to. So let me go ahead and reset this and see if those are the same size. It looks like they are. So this negative margin was actually pulling this image down to show a little bit less of it, which is fine. And it looks like now we are all lined up. So I'm going to actually overlay our card over here and see if everything is aligned. Let me go to overlaid and let's see how close we got to our actual code. So we have a little bit of a difference between our design and our code. So it looks like what's actually messing that up for us is we have this flexed container here that's making this inline flexed project company and project year a little smaller, take up a little bit less space than it was in the design. So I'm going to actually remove that flex box. We actually don't need that in order to make this work. I'm going to save this again. And as you can see, if I scroll, then I'm seeing this almost perfect to the design. The only thing I'm seeing is I actually have different button text than we had in the design. And in the design, it said visit live site. We say view live site right here. So I'm going to say visit live site, and that should tighten up this button text as well. So that looks really good right now. Now our card is exactly like it was in the design. The only difference is now we need some spacing in between each of those cards. And of course we can come up to our wrapping div and we'll just say flex call, and that should allow us to set the spacing with a gap. Let's try 16 and see where that puts us. And I don't think that's quite right. So let's try 14 and see if that gets any closer. Doesn't look like it. So let's go up to 20 and let's see if that's the proper spacing. And it does look like it is. So that is 20 or 80 pixels of spacing, I should say, or 5 rems in between each of these cards. So now all of our cards are looking great in the mobile view. The only difference that we have between that and our design is that at the top of this section, we don't have any additional spacing, but at the bottom of the section, we actually do in the design. So I'm going to go ahead and add that into our wrapping div. And actually, I should probably create this. I should probably change this to a semantic section. So I'm going to say section right here. I'm going to say section at the bottom, like so, and then we're going to go ahead and say class name equals, and then give that a value of PB16 for a padding bottom of 64 pixels, and that will just add that little bit of extra spacing on the bottom that it does have in the design. Now that I've done that, the only other thing that's also in the design that we're not seeing in our code, it's not easy to see because it is very light, but there is a grain texture behind each of these cards as well. So we can add this right here. So where we added our outline is exactly where we can also add the grain texture if we would like. In fact, I don't think we can do it there because we need to add a background image. So I'm going to have this as a separate div that's absolutely positioned inside of each of our portfolio project cards. So I'm going to go ahead and create that div. I'm going to say div class name equals absolute. It's going to say inset 0. And then that div is what we're going to add our grain image onto. So I'm going to say style equals, and we're going to give that a background image of URL, and we're going to give that a grain image source. Now, I don't think we've imported the grain image into this particular section yet, so we need to go ahead and import that. So I'm going to say import grain image from @assets/images/grain.jpg, and that will allow me to use it down here inside each of my cards. So I'm going to say grain image.source, and that will give that background image. Now we knew it would show up exactly like it did before on our hero, so we need to make sure that it's showing up underneath of our content. And the way that we do that is just basically go and make sure it has a negative Z index. So negative Z 10, because we've already reset our Z index, should put it below the content. And then we just need to make sure it has the right opacity. So I think the opacity is 5. So I'm going to say opacity 5 to just lighten that up a ton. And that's just going to give it a little bit of that grain texture that we see behind that card. Now that we worked through the look of our card, one of the things that I am noticing is that we cannot actually click these buttons or select this text, and that is because we have an after element that's sitting absolutely positioned with a higher Z index over our content. It's showing our outline and it has a transparent center. However, it's taking our clicks and not allowing us to click through to these other buttons and text. So what we need to do is we need to say that we need to give it the pointer events none rule so that it doesn't actually take the pointer events and allows it to pass through. So I'm going to say over here in my class name here, right here, I'm going to say after pointer events none, and that will add that on there. So after I save that, what we should see is we should be able to then refresh our page and then scroll up and down. And yes, now we see that we are able to use pointer events. Now our button is clickable. Now our text is selectable. And that's what we wanted to happen there. Now that we finished up the mobile view, it's time to work on our other responsive views. So let's go over to our tablet view and see how that's looking. And right now we are definitely seeing some serious differences. Let me go ahead and just pull this over a little bit so we can kind of see it. I'm actually going to pull that reference image opacity up a little bit. So we're actually seeing basically the reference image on the right and ours on the left. And we can tell that we have a different font size for our title, as well as we want to put that in a container as well, so that the description is not taking up nearly as much space. So let's see about doing that. Let me go into this portfolio projects header and let's see what we need to change in order to make this happen. So I'm first going to change this font size here. That is going to be a medium text 5XL to ensure that that font size comes up. Let's go ahead and see if that is correct. And that does look like it is. And then we also need to make sure that we have our paragraph description text coming up as well. That looks like it's going to be text large at this size. I'm going to say medium text large to ensure that that size comes up as well. We know that the paragraph might have too much space, so let's also give that a max width. So I'm going to say max width medium to give that a max of 448. Save that, and then to get that into the center of the page, I'm also going to have to add MX Auto to make sure that the margin left are auto. Let's see if that takes care of what we are looking at. So if I scroll up and down a little bit to get it to update, what you can see is when I slide back and forth, now that is pixel perfect, which is exactly what we wanted. A couple other things I'm seeing as we scroll down is that we have a little bit of more spacing, and we also have some font size changes here, as well as our button is now centered to the left instead of full width in our card. So we'll need to change those as well to get our card to update. And it looks like the padding is also a little bit different. So let's go ahead and take care of those issues right now. So right here, this is the wrapper to our cards. We need to go ahead and change the margin for that. So we're going to say at medium, so when it's a medium size, we're going to say MT20 to give it 80 pixels of spacing there on the top. And let me go ahead and just kind of give it a little bit of scroll to have it refresh. And then you can see that's fixed. Now we also need to give a little bit of different padding in our cards. So that looks like it is going to be a little bit different in the X direction as well as the Y direction. So let's see if we can do that. So we know that on the medium size in the top, I'm going to have to say PT12 to give it 48 pixels of padding on the top. And the sides are a little bit different than the top on the medium size. So medium px10 should hopefully do what we needed to do there. So let me just go ahead and give it a quick scroll. And yes, that does seem to have fixed our padding issue. Now we need to address our font size. So let me come down into my project title, and I'm going to give this a bigger font size. It looks like it's currently text 2XL. It looks like that goes up probably to text 3XL. So I'm going to say medium text 3XL and see if that is the right size. It doesn't quite look like it is. It might even be up to 4. Yes, it is up to 4XL. So let me go ahead and pull that up to 4XL, and that, after I refresh, hopefully it'll be the right size. It looks like there's also a margin difference from my smaller mobile size to my larger size. So I'm seeing a little bit more spacing in between those two as well. So let's go ahead and update that. We have our project title, which had a margin top of 8. It's now going to have a margin top of 20. So in the medium size, we're going to say MT5 for 20 pixels, and that should update that margin there. So let me just go ahead and give a quick scroll and then see if we have it configured correctly yet. So that, it looks like it's pixel perfect, but now we have to update some sizes down in our list, as well as a little bit of spacing on our horizontal rule. So it looks like currently our horizontal rule, which is located right here, has MT4. Let's see if we need to update that on the medium size to MT5. Hopefully that should change our spacing a little bit and allow that to be pixel perfect. And then down in our list, we know that we need to change the font size as well. So let's go down to our list and say, okay, it's text small right here. On the medium size, we're going to say text base to make it the 16 pixels with 24 pixels of line height. And we know we're going to have a little bit of margin on that as well. So up here we have MT4 for 16 pixels. At the medium size, it's going to be MT5, and that's just going to give it that little bit of extra margin. So let's see if that part is correct. We can see we have, that is almost exactly what we wanted. The only difference, it looks like, is our actual check icon size is a little bit bigger in the design than it is in our code. So we're going to need to change that as well. This is going to be that check circle icon, and it looks like what we're going to do with that is switch it to size 6 on the medium size as well, just to bring that up a little bit. Okay, let's go back and forth here again. And we can see that now the only difference is our button, which used to be full screen, and now we have it just over to the left in our tablet view. So let's go ahead and take care of that button as well. So I'm going to come down here to my button, and it currently says width full. So medium, we're going to say width auto, and see if that takes care of that. We also need some padding left and right. So let's ensure that we add that with PX4, and let's see if that takes care of that. If it doesn't, we can increase that size. It looks like it's a little bit bigger than that. Let's try PX8 and see if that takes care of it. So up that to PX8, and let me just go ahead and scroll back and forth right now. And it looks like we're almost perfect. It might actually be a little bit smaller than that. So let's come down to PX6 and see if that is what is going to make the correct adjustment. Okay, so that looks like it is essentially perfect left and right. So that is, I'm happy with where that's at. So let's go ahead and scroll down and see if there's any other problems that we currently have. So what we saw on the mobile version is we actually saw that there's a little bit of negative margin that was causing this image to come down in our card, and our card to take up a little bit less space. Now I'm seeing that margin reintroduced, or that negative margin taken away in this size, and that's what's causing this to now show that button instead of seeing it like we would expect on the bottom of the card. So essentially, all we have to do in this size is say medium negative MB0 to say that, okay, on the bottom, we don't want any negative margin anymore. That's going to make that pixel perfect. So let's go ahead and look at that one more time. And yes, that card looks pixel perfect. The only difference that we're seeing in our screen is essentially our top nav, which is of course fixed on the page. So that is exactly what we would expect. So let me go ahead and keep on going here, and let's see if there's any other differences that we see as we're continuing to scroll down the page. And I'm not seeing any right offhand on our tablet view, which means that our tablet view is now pixel perfect for the section, and we can move on to the desktop view. Coming over to our desktop view, there are definitely some differences here. Let me double check to ensure that those are real differences, and it looks like they are. So let's go ahead and do the same thing. I'm going to pull out my desktop view a little bit better to get a little bit better view of this. And then I'm going to come up to my reference image and just go ahead and pull this over so we can kind of see what the differences are. And I'm going to do the same thing where I knock up this image opacity all the way. So essentially we have our design on the right and we have our actual coded template on the left. So there's definitely a little bit of a size change, not a size of the text itself, but there's definitely a little bit of a padding top change here in this portfolio section. We're finally adding some padding top on the desktop size. And since the padding is for both the top and the bottom now, I'm just going to add it to both. So I'm going to say at the large size, we're going to say PY24, and hopefully that'll take care of our padding issue. Let me go ahead and go back and forth again and see if there's anything else that is different. So it looks like our font size for our description also is coming up a little bit. So let me come down into our font size for our description. We see that's currently text large. It's probably got to be extra large. So I'm going to say the large size, we're going to say text XL, and that should bring that font size up just a little bit as well. So let's see if and that is pixel perfect. That's exactly what we want. Let's continue to scroll down and see what else changes on our desktop size. So let's go ahead and look at this design real quick. So what we see is that now our card doesn't go from top to bottom. Now it goes from left to right. So we need to adapt our code to put our image on the right and our content on the left instead of it going from top to bottom. I'm also noticing a lot more spacing between our card and the edge of the screen than we currently have in our desktop view. Now we could handle this with the container alone, but I don't think in this case we are going to do that. We're just going to go ahead and make sure that the max width can't grow beyond what we're seeing here in our desktop view. So as we get this fixed up, I'm going to go ahead and pull our reference image over to the right again so that it's not overlaid, so we can kind of see what we're going for, because we're making some bigger, more major changes here in our desktop view. And actually it does look like we will go ahead and update our container to have the additional padding, or at least the max width at this large size, so that we're not seeing kind of the issues that we're seeing where we only have a little bit of spacing between the sides of our screen and the sides of our content. In order to do that, all we need to do is go ahead and open up our sidebar again, come back up to our globals.css, and then we're going to kind of modify how container works. So let's go ahead and come into and create a new layer for utilities. So if I put something in the utilities layer, it's going to come after all of the other things that Tailwind has brought in. And I'm going to say .container to target our container class. And we're just going to basically say @apply. When it gets to the large size, we're going to say max width 5XL, and that's going to keep it at that 1024 pixel value that we're seeing right here. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's see if that does update to be the right width. It looks like it does, but I'm going to close out my sidebar. I'm going to leave that globals up for a second, and I'm going to bring my reference image on top just to ensure that we do have it the right size over here at the edges of the screen. So pull this over here, and it does look like we're exactly the right size now. So that means that that takes care of our container problem. So I'm going to go close out our globals.css, and then we'll come back into our projects to make sure that we can go ahead and modify our cards. Pulling that reference image back out to the right, let's go ahead and ensure that we can push our content left to right. So what we need here are essentially two columns. We need to put our content over here in the left column, and we need to put our image in the right column. So if we look at the setup of our current card, we don't really have, we just have it kind of stacked on top of each other. So let's go ahead and add, after our green image background where our content is, let's go ahead and wrap everything in a div, and we'll go ahead and give that a class name of grid. And then we're going to say, or at least large grid. And then we're going to say large grid calls 2, because we want 2 different columns, one for the left and one for the right. And then we're going to just go ahead and put an ending div around our image down here. That will make sure that we have that grid. Now that grid's not going to work yet because we haven't defined where those columns should be defined. So the first one is going to be right here around all of our content from our company, year, title, our button, all of our text, all of that should be within that first column. So I'm going to end that right after that. And then our second column should just include the image itself. So I'm going to go ahead and add that div there as well. And let's see if that lines up our content left to right. And it looks like it does, which is exactly what we needed. So that means we can go ahead and work on some of the different spacings and sizings of the grid columns. We're going to go ahead and put a gap in between our columns, and it looks like that's going to be a gap of 16 for 64 pixels to put space between our title and of course our image. Everything I'm doing now I want to do just on the large size because we don't want it to have an effect later on in our other views. So I'm just going to go ahead and say large gap 16. And we can also see that we have some margin on the top of this image that we're going to be taking away. So I'm going to come down to my image and I'm going to say at the large size, we're going to say MT0 because we don't want any more margin on that image. We also need to adjust the padding around our card. So if we scroll over here to the right to see our design and scroll down, we can see that we have a lot more padding on our card than we did prior over here as well. So let's go ahead and adjust that padding by coming up to our card outline and seeing right now it is PX10 and we have padding top of 12. Let's go ahead and adjust that at the large size to now be padding top of 16 for 64 pixels, and our large size padding in the X direction, we're going to set that to 80 pixels. So go ahead and make those two changes and let's see how it's looking after that. Now we know that our image is a little bit small right now. That's fine. We're going to take care of that in a second because essentially we're going to absolutely position that image. So everything else is what we're trying to take care of. I think there is definitely a size difference between the text in one and the other, if I'm noticing that correctly, and there's definitely a padding difference down here. So let's see if we can't give a little bit of padding to this first column on the bottom to take care of the padding instead of giving it to the whole card. Otherwise, we're going to have to do some things with our image itself. I don't want to give padding to the whole card because I'd like my image to go to the very edges of the screen. So let's see if we can't just go ahead and give some padding to this first column on the bottom. So I'm going to say class name here to this first column. And then we're just going to take what we had on the top of the card at the large size, and we're going to say large PB 16, and that should give some padding bottom to that as well. Now let's see, after we go ahead and do a little bit of scrolling, let's see if we can overlay our reference image again and see what the differences are now that we've made these updates. So I'm seeing that everything now looks pixel perfect except for our image, which is great news. And that means that we can go ahead and adjust that image to now absolutely position that. And what we'd like to do is essentially make the image full height and then let the width just take care of itself. So the width is going to stay auto and the height is going to come to full height. So let's go ahead and try and take care of that by coming down to our image. And let's say at the large size, we're going to say that this is absolute. Also at the large size, we're going to say large H full to make sure that the height is 100%. And that looks like it does take care of it because we already had our width in place. So let me go ahead and pull the design back over again. And let's see if that did in fact take care of our issue. It's a little bit different. And I think that's only because we have an absolutely positioned image, but the column itself, I don't think is position relative. And we need to make sure that it's the height of the column. So in fact, let's come up to our column and say class name equals relative and see if that takes care of getting our image up a little bit. And not quite, that's fine. Let's go ahead and say large width full, or width auto, I should say. And then we'll also say large max width none to ensure that there's no max width that's taking effect and causing our image to get squished there. So the width auto may not have been needed. Let me see if I take it off what happens. Yeah, it looks like it is as well. So width auto will make sure that the width is set to the dimensions of the photo at that height. So the height is full, and then the max width just ensures that it doesn't have to stay within the boundaries of that relative container. So I'm going to come back over, and now it is 100% pixel perfect, which of course I love to see. So let's continue to scroll down, and make sure that's the case for the rest of this section. Okay, so I'm not noticing any differences between our design and our actual coded template. So I'm going to go ahead and switch this back. I'm just going to go ahead and put the coded template here as the majority of our view. I'm going to do the same thing in, let me just go ahead and double check that, but that looks good as well. So that I'm going to scoot that over. And then of course on the mobile version, it looks like that's also the case. So I can go ahead and flip that over and just ensure that we don't have any differences. And indeed, it doesn't look like we do. It looks like this section is all done and it's time to move on to next section. Coming back into this look at our design, let's go ahead and scroll down past this project section, and we have this little strip here that we'd like to add that's going to animate and just provide a nice polished touch to this portfolio site. So it's going to have a number of words scrolling from right to left. The other interesting thing is it has this little bit of an angle that we're going to put the whole thing at. And of course, the words are going to look like they're appearing on one side and disappearing on the other. So even though it is a very simple section, it's going to have a lot that's going to go into it. The same thing is true of tablets, just a little bit wider. We're going to make sure that gradient is back there, and then we have our words appearing and disappearing on the edges of the screen. And then on the desktop view, we're just going to see a wider version of that, but it's going to stretch across the entire screen no matter the size of the screen. Now that we understand what we're building here, let's go ahead and dive into our code. As with the other sections, we need to make sure that it's imported into our page. So that's going to be this tape section here. So I'm going to come into my app/page. I'm going to make sure that that is imported as tape section from @section/tape. And then I'm going to drop it into the bottom of my page by dropping tape section as a component to the bottom of my div and saving. After I do that, as I scroll down, I should be able to see that there's some text there, and I do, which means everything is hooked up in my page. I can close that out, and I'm going to come to my tape.tsx. Now in this section, I'm going to close out my sidebar and give my browser a little more room because we want to put my design off to the side so that we can see what's going on with our design and our code. So we know that we're going to have a long list of words in here. So let's go ahead and just create that first. We're going to come in here and let's go ahead and create, maybe we'll just create the array above it. So let's go ahead and just create a const words, and then we're going to create an array. We're going to have performant. We're going to have accessible. We're also going to have secure, interactive. We're going to have the words scalable, user-friendly, maintainable, search optimized, usable, and last but not least, reliable. Okay, so that list of words we're then going to bring inside of our div, and we're going to map through them. So I'm going to say words.map, and then for each of those words, I'm going to have a word, and we're going to just go ahead and show a div for that. So we're going to say div, and of course the key is going to be equal to whatever that word is. That's a string, and then inside that, we're going to actually show that word alongside of our star icon. So we'll put that in a span tag. So we'll have our word itself, and then beside that word, we're going to have our star icon. In order to use that star icon, though, of course, we need to import it. So I'm going to import my star icon from @assets/icons/star.svg, and that will allow me to use that. So I'm going to just put my star icon here and then go ahead and save that section. Now, if we scroll down, we can see that our words right now are not next to each other. And of course, that's because they need to be flexed one after the other. So I'm going to wrap a div around my words, and that is going to be what we'll use to control the flex of these words. So I'm going to say class name equals flex. That flex container is going to have a gap of 4. And then each of the words themselves also needs to be inline flexed so that we can put the star beside the word. So I'm going to come into this div and have a class name here of inline flex, and that should allow the stars to be next to the words. And of course, I'm going to give it the same gap because I want the space between the star on both sides to be exactly the same. For the star icon itself, it needs to be a little bit bigger. So I'm going to come in here and say class name equals size 6 to give it a height and width of 24 pixels. So it just makes that star icon, or at least keeps it the same size. And now we just need to see how we're going to put on our background and of course style our text so that we have the right styles for that. So let's worry about the background first. Well, let's wrap this in another div, because essentially this outer div, what we're going to do with that is we're going to add some padding on the top and bottom. So let me go ahead and just add that in real quick. Class name equals py16. That should give some padding on the top and bottom, just give some spacing for this section. Inside that, we want our content to have this gradient, but of course we're going to be fading out the words, but we're not going to be fading out the background gradient, which means we need to put it in another div. So I'm going to wrap this in another div that's going to hold our gradient, and we're going to give this a class name of bg gradient to right, and that is going to be from our emerald 300 to our sky 400, and that should allow the gradient to be in the right position. Now you can see that the strip is probably taller than you expect because we didn't add any height, we haven't added any padding yet, and if we scroll over to the right, you can see that some of these words are wrapping because of the way that we've flexed them together. So essentially, this flex right here is causing some of those words to eventually wrap, and that's because it doesn't have the space to just continue to go off of this screen. And of course we need to hide the overflow as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap yet another div around our flexed container, because we want to be able to make this div eventually say flex none. But of course, in order to say flex none, you have to have a flex container around it. So I'm going to tell this div to be class name equals flex, and then this one is going to say flex none, and that should allow it just to be as wide as it needs to be without having to wrap any of those words. Of course, we're not going to be scrolling left to right, so we are going to eventually have some sort of overflow hidden on one of these, and that's probably going to come in right here. Let's go ahead and try to do that. So I'm going to say overflow x clip, and that should clip the edges of the screen to ensure that it doesn't go off the sides of the screen. So yeah, when I scroll over now, I'm not seeing that same problem. Let's go ahead and make sure our text is all styled up. So I'm going to give this a class name of text gray 900. We also want this to be uppercase. The font weight has to come up, so that's going to be font extra bold. And it looks like the text is probably a little bit large right now, so we're going to say text small, SM for small. And we also want our star to be aligned to the center of our text. So on this inline flex, I'm going to say items center, and that should align our stars to the center of the text. The star itself also needs to be the right color, so I'm also going to tell the star icon to be text gray 900 to make it the same color as the text itself. After that, let's go ahead and look at how we can add some padding to the top and bottom of this text. So we could probably just go ahead and add that padding right on here. So let me try that. I'm going to say py4 to see if we can add a little bit of padding. Looks like it's a little big, so let's come down to py3. And that looks like it is the right amount of padding. Because we want the text to fade out on the left and right, we need to add a mask for that text somewhere that's not going to affect our BG gradient. So inside our BG gradient, we'll add that mask to this flexed div right here. So I'm going to say mask image, and that's going to be a linear gradient to the right. And that's going to start with transparent, go to black, probably at 10%. Stay at black till 90%, and then just go to transparent again. And that should fade off the edges of our text. Now that's all looking pretty good right now. The only thing we have to address now is the rotation of the entire section. So I don't want to rotate it at the section level. I think I'm just going to rotate it right here where we're putting our background. So let's go ahead and see if we can do that by saying negative rotate 3 degrees. And let me go ahead and hit save and see if that does the proper rotation. And it looks like it does. The real only difference in what we see right here on the screen versus what's in the design is that now, because we've rotated this div, we have our background kind of ending just a little before the actual div ends. So I'm also going to pull this out by saying negative mx1. And essentially what that's going to do is it's going to put a little bit of negative margin on the left and right to ensure that we don't have the little edges of that showing. The other thing that looks like it's a little bit rotated versus what I'm seeing in the design is these stars. So these stars are straight up and down between this text, but in the design, they have a little bit of negative rotation as well. So let me go ahead and see if I can add that into each star icon by saying negative rotate 12, and that should pull those back so they have a little bit of that rotation value. Okay, now that I've gotten this far, it looks like it's pixel perfect, but of course we can only double check by seeing the design overlaid on top. And I am seeing that it looks perfect from what I'm seeing. So let's go ahead and just do a quick check by increasing our design opacity and then pulling this left to right and just doing it and seeing if we can see any changes. And that looks pixel perfect on the mobile view. Since that's the case, let's go ahead and check the rest of the designs and see if our tablet or our desktop view is having any problems. So this is the tablet view. I can of course pull out my design and I'm seeing this is changing just a little bit. Let me just double check and see if that is a problem with the image alignment. And it looks like it may have been just an issue with the image alignment because now I'm not seeing really any changes in my design versus what I'm seeing in my image. And then over in the desktop view, we need to double check this one as well. So I'm going to pull out my browser just so we can see this a little bit larger and make sure that we don't have any issues here. So let me go ahead and pull my design over versus my text. And it looks like there's just a little bit more spacing on the top and bottom of this section in the desktop view. So let's see if we can handle that by going ahead and coming back and adding a little bit more spacing. So on the large size, we're going to say PY24 and hopefully that will ensure that we have the spacing set up correctly. So I'm gonna go ahead and just adjust this by scrolling, and then let me come in here and see if that does it. And it looks like it does indeed take care of that spacing issue. It also looks like there may be a slight difference in how our text is aligned, and that actually looks like it might be because we're actually missing one of the words that I'm seeing right here. I'm actually seeing a responsive word on the design that I'm not seeing in my group of text. So let me go ahead and add that right after it looks like maintainable. Let me just go and double check that again. So we have user-friendly, responsive, and then maintainable. So responsive should be a word that we added in here. So I'm going to add responsive and then save that, and hopefully that will fix that issue that we had. So I'm seeing a slight difference between what I'm seeing in my browser and what I'm seeing in my design. And part of that difference is because we have just the tiniest bit of left and right scroll that we can do. And you can even see that it has this icon here that shows that we have some overflow that's possible. Now, the reason for that is because we have this negative margin. We're saying overflow clip, but that overflow clip on the same div that we added our negative margin to is not going to help us. We actually need that to be on the section itself. So I'm going to move this up to our section and see if that takes away the issue that we have with overflow scrolling. So let me go ahead and refresh my page real quick and let's see if that icon goes away. It looks like it does. And not only that, but our design has been completely tightened up so that it is perfectly pixel perfect, which I love to see. With that, I think this wraps up this section. So let's go back and double check that we have everything working the way that we want it to on all these other sections one more time. So just in case that were to affect anything, and it doesn't look like it did, it looks perfect. So that with that, let's go on to our next section.
That completes part 1 of this tutorial series. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive even deeper into custom animations and we'll complete this project. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss part 2. In the meantime, here's another great video to watch. I'll see you in the next video.